Welcome to this webinar, the second in our series on shared equity and collaborative ownership for housing and agriculture. This is webinar number 2, which is going to be focusing more on situations where someone owns the building but leases the land underneath it, which has a lot of potential for creative solutions and also some potential pitfalls that we'll be talking about tonight. So this series, this multi-part webinar series, is organized by a number of different organizational partners working collaboratively together, including GMEDC, True Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission, Vital Communities, and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. There's a number of different staff contacts at those organizations, and we're sort of divvying up who's the main point person coordinating and leading each of these webinars. So down that left-hand side, you can see those people and listed in chronological order by webinar. And tonight, this webinar is organized and hosted by myself, Sarah Danley, and by my colleague, John Hafner from Vital Communities. But you can see some other awesome people coming up to host webinars further on in the series. So before we get started in the content of this session, I did want to do like a brief overview of the series as a whole. I apologize that this is duplicative for those of you who are on the first webinar as well. But we really just want to take a moment to talk about like, what do we mean by shared equity and collaborative ownership? And the answer is like, we, the organizers, haven't come up with a really good, concise definition of what we're looking at. We're actually looking at a huge range of tools, from community land trusts to variations on the community land trust model, ground leases, which is what we'll be focusing on tonight, resident-owned communities, which is one of the other topics for tonight, cooperatives, LLCs, other co-ownership agreements, equity building lease provisions, deed restrictions, and easements. So a whole range of different tools. The extremely untechnical summary in my head of what we're looking at is models where individual homeowners, landowners, and land stewards are sharing ownership with each other or with the community in order to make it more affordable and therefore more accessible to have some ownership. So what are our goals for the series? One of our goals is to think creatively about different ways that land use and land ownership could work in and for our community. Not to imply that any one of these tools is right for all people or for all communities. We're also hoping to gain inspiration and insight from great work happening in other states that we might not otherwise stumble across in our day-to-day work, while also recognizing that there are many excellent efforts happening in Vermont already, and we hope that one of the functions of this can help people connect with each other. Finally, our goal is not to imply that younger generations or marginalized communities should give up on the opportunity for wealth building or settle for being renters forever. Rather, we're looking at these tools as ways that can help more people build equity, even when traditional property ownership is not actually a possibility. As I alluded to, one of our goals is to help people connect with each other. I put the slide at the end last time, and then I realized the link, I went in the chat right before we closed out, so you might not actually have gotten a chance to click it on the last session. We put together a Jamboard, which is essentially like a digital like bulletin board, essentially, for folks who are interested in connecting with others to add a note with your contact information and what specifically you're interested in order to see who else is there and see whether you might want to make some connections outside of this webinar series. And one of the benefits to having this virtual bulletin board is that we're keeping the same one running across all of the different webinars. So it's also a way to potentially connect with people who might have been attending a different webinar than you are. So I think John is going to put that in the chat now if he hasn't already. Great. So that's the overview on this webinar series. Tonight's session is on, like I said, owning the building but leasing the land, which is usually called ground leases. There can be a couple other terms for it as well. Going to do a really quick overview of what that actually means before we get to the meat of the presentation tonight, which is our guest speakers. What is a ground lease? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even a technical expert on this. This is not a legal or even technical definition, but I wanted to share some of how I understand what this topic actually is. So what we're looking at tonight is cases where one party owns the land and a different party leases that land but owns the structures that sit on it, which might be a case of purchasing an existing structure as part of the arrangement. It might also be a case of leasing the land and then owning whatever they build on it. It's actually used fairly frequently, especially in commercial contexts. So in these cases, the lease is really long-term, for example, even up to 99 years. Sometimes the landowner is a government, other times they're private individuals or corporations. From my internet research on this, I've discovered that often these are used in franchise deals where the corporate headquarters actually own the land and the franchisee rents the land and builds and owns the facility. Also used fairly frequently in manufactured home parks. In these cases, the lease is usually short-term, a year or two or even less. Manufactured home parks can be owned by anyone, like other real estate, but they are increasingly owned by private equity firms. And we'll be learning a little bit more about that situation in manufactured home parks later on tonight. So also, the ground lease is also an important tool in community land trust, which was the subject of our first webinar. So the distinction here when a ground lease is used through a community land trust is that the land is owned not by an individual or a private corporation, but by the community land trust, which is a not-for-profit legal entity where the owners of the buildings and other community members have an open line of communication and a voice in decision-making. So what we'll be hearing about tonight as we dive deeper into this idea of a ground lease. Tonight, we'll be hearing about a community land trust that leases a certain property to one household who owns their house and also farms the property, and then also has a ground lease with a second household that owns their own house as well. That's probably not a very clear explanation, but we'll be hearing from those speakers next. We'll also be hearing about what it can look like in a manufactured home park when the residents, who are the owners of the homes, also collectively own the land through the co-op. So still keeping that same distinction where the land is owned differently than the structures, but in this case, the owners of the structures also cooperatively own the land. So our agenda for tonight is a brief introduction to the series and to ground leases, which is what I just did. Next, we'll be hearing from Bridget Spann and Don Zasada of Caretaker Farm, who live and farm via a ground lease on a property owned by the Berkshire Community Land Trust. Then we'll be hearing brief remarks by John Hafner, who's the housing program manager at Vital Communities. Hearing from Sarah Marchant of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, speaking about their work as ROC New Hampshire, which stands for Resident Owned Community New Hampshire, and saving a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A with you all. And then finally, as a brief closing, we'll be introducing the next webinar in the series. That's what I have as an introduction. Any quick clarifying questions? I think we're good to move on to our first speakers, Bridget and Don.
Okay, I think I'll get started then. I am not in the same location as Bridget, and so oftentimes when we're doing presentations, we give one another an elbow, so they talk or I talk. So hopefully we can bounce in between the two of us easily here tonight. So thank you for inviting us to talk. I'll just give a very, very brief intro in the sense that we're just over the Vermont border in Williamstown, Massachusetts. We have a farm that's 34 acres. It's primarily vegetables. There's a little bit there. We have some animals. And when we're talking about the buildings that are involved in this, we have our own home, and then there's a barn, and there's also 2 sheds. And we don't own any of the land that's part of the farm, but we do own the buildings that are on those. So Bridget, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. So when we moved to Caretaker Farm, it was owned outright by the then wanting to retire farmers, and through a very complex arrangement that involved equity trust, which consulted and put together the deal. The farm was sold to equity trust. Equity trust then issued the ground leases and sold the houses back to us, the land to a local land trust, Williamstown Rural Lands, and the other house on the property back to the original owners, who as the retiring farmers wanted to continue to live on the land. And as far as the different roles, Equity Trust wanted very much to see this deal happen. They didn't see their role as being a land trust owning properties all over the US. They really wanted to have local land trusts step up to not only preserve land, but preserve active farmland with farmers on it. So Equity Trust provided a lot of technical expertise. They have the model leases on their website, and it was a many years in the making project, even before Don and I moved to the farm, of putting together this deal, and Williamstown Rural Lands taking on the role of becoming essentially the landlord. We have an agricultural lease, and that involves our use of the property and different restrictions about us in the house as well, like needing to be active there 8 months a year, etc. The other house on the property, they have a residential lease, and so they have fewer restrictions in their lease. And a prime distinction between the agricultural lease and the residential lease has to do with the when it's time to sell the farm, that we will be selling it based on a resale formula. And for the residential lease, they did not implement resale formulas. So a lot of this is available on our website and in other places, or feel free to contact us if you want more about the nitty gritty, but we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. The other part that's relevant in our situation is that prior to the ground leases being issued, there had already been an agricultural preservation restriction issued by the state for Caretaker Farm. And so that covers 32.5 of the acres. And then there's a 2.5 acre cutout area where the two houses are. The other thing that is really important is just all the different parties. It was a big process of identifying everyone's interests and how to sort of put the deal together. And that's where the role of Equity Trust was really fantastic, to be talking to all the different partners to figure out how to make the deal come together, and basically where was the money going to come from. That was a big challenge of this project. Don.
One of the questions that was asked of us is what aspects of having a ground lease has the most effect on our day-to-day life and business, for better, for worse. And I mean, I would say that, first of all, it's wonderful for us to have a ground lease, in the sense that we don't have this massive mortgage, all the pressure of paying back a massive mortgage. We're very happy to have this lease. And in fact, a lot of the restrictions of the lease, if not every single restriction within the lease, is something that we had already been doing. So it was already a way in which we farmed. So we didn't have to change the way we farmed in order to adhere to some of the needs of the lease. Having said that, if we're going to, if we ever need signatures for grants that we write, we need to go to the land trust to have those signed. Some examples of that are, we put up some solar panels, we put in a composting toilet, we had a new wash station, and all of these, if they're permanent, then we need the okay from the land trust. But also, if I'm applying for grants, oftentimes we need the signature of the landowner. Every year we write a report to the land trust. We have a very comfortable relationship with the land trust. I think if we were running into issues with our business, or if just weird things were happening on the farm and the town was uncomfortable with it, then it would be a whole different conversation. But the reality is, right now, we don't have a heck of a lot of involvement or interaction with the land trust, because things are going pretty smoothly. And as far as how did we come into contact with this whole situation, is we were looking for land to farm. And in our search for land in the Northeast, it either seemed like we could afford kind of a rundown farm in the middle of Maine, or other kind of pretty challenging options. And so once we heard, this is a pretty, it's a well-known farm. It's it's a first certified organic farm in Massachusetts. And we had seen an advertisement about this farm. They were hoping to transfer it to a young farming family and have a 99-year lease worked up. And so we had read about it, and we had applied for it. Honestly, it was a pretty challenging process to go through. We moved to the farm, and then for about a year, we were knocking out all of the details of the lease. And so there were 4 different entities: ourselves, the previous owners, a local land trust, and a national land trust that was giving us different help, suggestions and help along the process. And each of those entities had different wants. And so we did come up with wonderful compromises. And, I think being able to look at it now, 16 years later, I think there's some things that we may have pushed back a little harder on. And yet it was a really nice compromise with all of the 4 different groups that were there.
And also, just for people to know, as the holders of the ground lease, so our ownership of the buildings is contingent on us being in good standing with the ground lease. And we do pay rent on the land. And so we pay $705 a year for renting the agricultural land. We also pay $8,211 in property tax. And one of the stipulations of our lease is that we pay the property tax. So even though the land is officially owned by a land trust, which is a nonprofit, it was important as far as the project that they felt like the idea was to keep the property on the tax roll. So that's a stipulation in our lease. Yeah, go ahead, Don, sorry. Oh, and someone just asked in the chat, yes, Sam and Elizabeth Smith, who they had been for years in the house across the driveway, they just moved into town this year, but the retiring farmers had been on the farm until just this year. But they still own the other house on the property.
The question that sometimes comes up also is, did we encounter any challenges in financing? Bridget, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. When we were looking at financing, we were seeing all these then attractive interest rates. And in talking to some of the big banks that advertise those, they were like, once they learned about the deal, they were like, oh, no, that project is not of interest to us because we couldn't sell your mortgage on the secondary market. We would have to hold on to it as a banking institution. And so quickly it became us going for a slightly higher rate, but for a local community bank in town. And really it was a fantastic mortgage officer who was like, I get this project, I want this project to work, and we want to be the bank that helps make it happen. So that was sort of about those personal relationships. We had also talked to Farm Credit, First Pioneer Farm Credit, and they were wonderful as well. And we ended up going with them for an equipment loan. But it was sort of tricky. We couldn't go through just any bank to make the financing happen.
And if and when we want to move, it's a 99-year lease. It's transferable. It's actually renewable. So, we signed it when we were 35. We can renew it when we're 134, and then when we're 233, it's over. So we have absolute security in. And as a farmer, that's really what we were looking for, is to have security in the land, not necessarily, we didn't need to own the land at all. We just needed long-term security, and this has allowed that. So we can pass this on to our heirs. Bridget, you were talking earlier with me about a stipulation to that.
Right, so whoever enters into the lease arrangement has to be a qualified person, meaning that they can be here and be involved in the active day-to-day management of the farm. And so there was a lot of community fundraising and other things that went to make this happen. And so in our situation, the idea is that whoever's living here on the farm is actively farming it on a day-to-day basis, because you don't want to sort of have this project happen and then to have someone here who's still here but not farming. So it was really a benefit for the community. The other thing I want to say, as we were looking at properties before arriving at Caretaker Farm, we did talk to one land trust director about a property that they had just purchased, and it wasn't going to be developed. And it was very interesting because she said to us, from our perspective as a land trust, our job is done. This land isn't going to be developed. And I think for us as farmers, it was like, wait, the process is just beginning, as far as from a farming perspective, how to ensure that a farmer is on the land. And I really appreciated the former executive director of Williamstown Rural Lands, who was sharing the perspective that the Caretaker Farm project gives rural lands the opportunity to move beyond farmland preservation to farm preservation. And it's a really important distinction and really critical to the survival of small family farms. I'm just looking through our questions, Sarah, that you wanted us to cover, and I know the time is.
We've got time to take some audience questions too. We've actually got several in the chat. Should we go to some of those?
Yes.
So Alan asked, what was your local bank? It's nice to know about those who are most helpful.
It was our local bank. It was Williamstown Savings Bank, which has now been bought by a larger bank, Mountain One. So our little bank is not exactly the same, but at the time it was our little local bank.
Gotcha. Oh, go ahead.
Don, do you see the chat? How are improvements handled?
Yeah, great question. So I think that's one of the areas that if we had to do it over again, we would have advocated differently. So essentially, any improvements to our house, to any of the buildings, we will not be compensated at all for those. The way in which the farm will be valued when we leave will be an agricultural, what's it called, Bridget? An agricultural appraisal?
As restricted agricultural appraisal.
Right. So with some of the other farms that have done this with leases, there are different formulas that take into consideration the money that the farmer spends on improvements. So if it's an improvement that increases the agricultural value of the land, then that will be taken into consideration. But if we spend $50,000 and redo our kitchen and our bathrooms, that will not be, we won't be compensated for that.
There will be no marble countertops, but the point of it was to make sure that someone doesn't come in and improve it so much that it then would not be affordable to the next farmer.
Right. But I think the drawback is there's no strong incentive for us to make improvements on some of the buildings. And so that's the only thing that drives that is if we know we're going to be there for decades, we would like to maintain it because it needs to be maintained. But from a strictly financial perspective, if someone's on the way out, there's no real incentive to take care of it in that way.
Yeah. And I'm just looking at another question in the chat. What happens if you can't or don't want to farm anymore? So to the extent that we are here, we do have to be involved with the active day-to-day management of the farm. The lease does provide a length of time for us to try to sell the farm, and the land trust it is about them and us agreeing that the person with whom we enter into a selling situation is a qualified person, and our lease does define what a qualified person is. And our lease is very much based on the equity trust model lease on their website. So you're welcome to contact us for a copy of our lease, but I would almost encourage you to start with equity trust, which I think is a better starting point as a model lease document. And who gets to move into the other house on the land, the original? So the other house on the property, there's a residential lease, so there are not restrictions about who lives in that house. So it's still owned by Sam and Elizabeth Smith, who just a few months ago moved into town. And to the extent that they own it, they get to decide who lives in that house, but there aren't any restrictions.
So they would get to decide who to sell it to or pass it on to with no other parties having a say in that decision.
Exactly. And that's one of those that this deal was so complicated to put together. Maybe looking back with more energy, or maybe at a future point, it might be, hey, affordable housing is another goal of the local land trust. How can we ensure that the residential lease goes to someone who meets affordable housing criteria? So there's room for that in the future. And the last thing, I know Don said we don't have as much contact with the land trust, and I think you're thinking as far as problematic contact. The executive director of the land trust is a farm member of our CSA. Many of the board members are CSA members. We live in a small town. We've collaborated on educational programs and other things. So we have a lot of informal, social, and other contact with the land trust. It's a very positive relationship, and one we're invested in keeping positive. It's not so much, it doesn't feel like a problematic, someone's looking over our shoulder, telling us what to do, etc. They've been incredibly supportive of us.
So we are going to have time for more questions and group conversation for all of the speakers at the end. But before we move on, I think John Echeverry's is the clarifying question on what the leaseholder, what would be the leasehold security of your heirs or transferee after your 99 years? What do your heirs or transferees actually have in terms of leasehold security?
Well, so they have both the ability to enter into a lease, and to the extent that they can do that, then ownership of the property. When we had the as restricted appraisal of the property, the appraiser did say, just to let you know, you're going to be looking at that value for a long time. So if we had taken that same amount of money and put it in a small ranch in town without restrictions, it would increase according to the market. But the money that we put into purchasing the farm, which was affordable, which is why we're here, it's not going to increase in value the way the market around us is. So as far as the security, it's both the value of the buildings, their as restricted agricultural value, plus the ability to enter into the 99-year lease.
John, did that answer your question, or did I misarticulate your question from the chat?
Maybe I take it it's a 99-year lease, and I'm just trying to figure out, it's obviously not you who's going to be there on the 98th year and wondering what's going to happen, but maybe your grandchildren will be there. And then what do they do on the 98th year if they want to stay?
So
and what are their rights? What are their rights to stay? I understand the economics. They're not going to be able to sell for a big premium, but I'm just interested in their land security, whether they have a right to stay on the land.
So Bridget, correct me if I'm wrong, but like if it transfers to our children in 10 years, then they would start up a new 99-year lease.
Yeah, I'm not entirely, I know the 99 years is renewable. I'm trying to think whether it's transferred and you start counting over again, or you keep going on wherever you're at, but it is 99 years plus renewable.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I'd like to pass over to John Hafner now to transition to the next segment. And then again, we'll have more time at the end for group questions and conversation with everyone. Thank you so much, Don and Bridget. This was great.
Hey, thanks, Don and Bridget. And by way of transferring or transitioning us over into talking about housing, briefly, I'll soon introduce Sarah Marchant, who is Chief of Staff and Vice President of ROC-NH with the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. And to sort of help contextualize what Sarah will be talking about, I'm just going to sort of highlight what Bridget had said, is that, you know, the idea of preserving affordable housing, which would potentially be something that a community land trust could look at in the future. One of the most effective mechanisms for low income and moderate income individuals to achieve home ownership has been manufactured home parks. And one of the ways that resident-owned communities as a tool for ownership of manufactured home parks has been a mechanism for preserving that affordability of manufactured home parks. Because one of the challenges of manufactured home parks is that while the residents may own their home, the building that they're living in, they pay rent on the land that the manufactured home is situated on. And so what Sarah is going to help explain is that how resident-owned communities has become a model for the residents of these manufactured home parks to collectively own the land that their homes are situated on. And so this has been a really, I think, exciting and effective tool for combining the affordability of manufactured homes and preserving it as a home ownership option for low and moderate income individuals, while helping to circumvent some of these challenges that are associated with ground leases that have come up in conversation thus far. So without further ado, I'm just going to kick it over to Sarah Marchant with the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund to give us an overview of what resident-owned communities are and how they are an effective tool for affordable housing and for managing ground leases. So take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, John, and nice to meet everybody here virtually. I do have a very short presentation, so I'm going to share my screen real quick here. Here we go. Hopefully it's going to work. All right,
There it is.
there it is. Let's see, we're pausing. Okay, hopefully you can see the screen now. And just real quickly.
Sorry, Sarah, we're just seeing your notes as well. So I don't know if you
Oh,
can sort of.
Okay, how do we get out of this? Hold on one sec. Is that better?
We're just waiting on that.
Trying. Did it work?
There it goes. Just had to think
Okay.
about it for a little bit. All right, you are good to go.
All right, sorry, it is very slow here today. Apparently, my internet is not as fast as it should be, but so here we go. Hopefully you've heard of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. If you haven't, just for quick background, we are a not-for-profit that provides lending and access to credit where traditional lending institutions are not able to. We are based on two founding principles. One, that people with low incomes or businesses and nonprofits who lack access to credit, that holds them back from bettering their lives and their situations. And second, that there are people and institutions who do have capital and lending ability that want to help folks in their neighbors and their communities, but they don't have the expertise or ability to manage those loans. So that's where we come in. We are a bridge between the supporters and borrowers so that neighbors can help neighbors. We're really focused on localism at its best. So whenever there's a gap in funding for a family to buy a home or manufactured homeowners to buy their community, or even a business to create or keep jobs, we want to be there to fill that gap and make our state better. Our borrowers work really hard and they repay us over 97% of the time. So these loans are totally viable. And on top of that, of all the people who invest with us, who allow us to do this great work and to make sure that their money helps their neighbors in the community, in our almost 40 years of business, we have never not repaid an investor with interest. So by acting as this bridge, we're meeting the needs of our people and organizations and businesses that are overlooked, and we're meeting the needs of our neighbors to unleash the potential of our communities. So first, let's talk about manufactured housing. I'm not sure if when I said manufactured housing or when John or Sarah did earlier, if this is the picture that came into your head. And I'm hoping maybe by the end of this, you'll have some different pictures in your head. So manufactured housing, we used to call it mobile homes or trailers. It is a real defined term by state statute. It is not a modular house, and it is not a tiny home. I'm sure that you've heard a lot of things about tiny homes, but these are homes that come on a steel chassis. Once they are placed, their axles and hitches are removed. So these are not mobile. They are not easy to move. It is incredibly important that people understand that they are placed, and they are placed permanently. They are built in a factory without the influence of weather, and the waste at the end of the production line would fit into a 55-gallon trash container. So these are really safe, tight, resource efficient homes, and most of the ones we place are Energy Star certified. And there are some really great new products coming out that even take it steps beyond that. There's been a superseding HUD code of the building code since 1976 to ensure building quality and construction. And this is real estate. It is real estate in New Hampshire. It appreciates in value just like any other property in the community. And it's a really smart place in housing for young families, first-time home buyers, retirees, downsizers, and everybody in between. So I'm going to talk about our resident-owned communities now. And here's a picture of one of our resident-owned communities as they were purchasing their community. So essentially, there are manufactured home housing parks throughout New Hampshire. There's around a little over 450 in New Hampshire, of which now 145 are owned by the residents. So essentially, most of the parks have an owner who owns the land and the roads and the water sewer lines or the septic and well systems, and they have the ability to by New Hampshire law to let the owners of the homes that are placed in those parks to give them notice, and in 18 months they can close a park and you have to move your home, which is very, very difficult, nearly and very expensive. And it's really insecure to have your largest asset in that kind of jeopardy. This resident-owned community program is the Community Loan Fund's first and most well-known program. And we, over time, have also built a program called our Welcome Home Loans. So we actually provide traditional mortgages to manufactured homes that are placed in resident-owned communities or on their own land. But the key thing here is that in a manufactured home community, it creates a stable, secure, affordable home. And it is affordable in perpetuity. It also creates a real community. When we find out that a manufactured home park is going up for sale, we mobilize our teams and go door to door to talk to people about the opportunity they have to potentially buy their community. And sometimes we find that neighbors really have never met neighbors, but going through this process, the community comes together and you find out who your neighbors are. You know, recently we found out a woman who ended up running for the treasurer of the board had been a controller at the Pease Air Force Base trade port now. And folks really keep an eye on each other in these neighborhoods. They're true neighborhoods. You know, they're noticing if somebody's walk's not shoveled or if you didn't get your newspaper. And so they're checking on each other. They're hauling groceries. They're helping each other out when things get difficult. And they're actually usually really nice communities. Many were built before current standards. I'm an urban planner by trade, so I know that most communities require 24 feet of pavement for all their roads, and these aren't like that. So they're a little bit more narrow. They're great for walking and biking. They make it feel like a neighborhood, safe and compatible. And working with resident-owned communities in New Hampshire, once they buy it, they truly care and want to improve and keep up their communities. And we've leveraged over $42 million in infrastructure improvements in the resident-owned communities we work with in the last 15 years. These are water and sewer upgrades and really important improvements that these neighborhoods need. So who lives in manufactured homes and in our resident-owned communities? Over 35% are your essential workers. So your retired police chief, your emergency room nurse, your grocery store workers, childcare providers, teachers, they're your neighbors, and plumbers. There's all ages, all age groups, and all incomes. Although we do, over 80% of our residents make 60% of the area median income or less. And we have a pretty high population that make less than 30% of the area median income. It's an opportunity to give everybody who lives there a vote. You get a chance to run for the board. You can develop and enhance your leadership skills, and it gives you the power to help stabilize your rent. These are beautiful homes. They're easy one-floor living. Many have ramps added on. Most have decks and porches. You can park your car right beside your house. There is nobody on the other side of your wall like an apartment or some of the condos. And you have some yard and garden space. Most have a shed. And it's very safe and secure for you to invest in your property for the long run. Just for some other kind of context here, over 7% of all homeowners in New Hampshire own a manufactured home. It's about 10% nationwide. And these are not rental properties. In our resident-owned communities, this is an ownership model, and you need to own the home to be part of the community. We do have vacant lots in existing resident-owned communities. There's over 250 vacant lots statewide right now that are awesome opportunities for new homes to be placed and more affordable housing to be brought into our state. There's 145 resident-owned communities, and we got there in almost 40 years. We will have our 40th anniversary in September. Based on some rules that make New Hampshire unique, first in the country, and that our really forward-thinking legislature put in place. First, manufactured housing is true real estate in New Hampshire. In other parts, mainly the Midwest and West, it's considered chattel, more like a car. But here it is true real estate. It appreciates in value and is taxed exactly the same as any other home. But most importantly, the legislature through RSA 205A gave residents the opportunity to purchase anytime a park comes up for sale. The residents, you have to negotiate in good faith with the residents, and they can match the same price and the same conditions as the original offer on the table. And so since that law went into effect, and we've had such great success with it, it has been replicated in some ways across the country, but that the requirement that the owner, if the residents match the price, and that the owner has to negotiate in good faith with the residents, has been left out of a lot of communities. And what we find is that the owner is not nationally, not in New Hampshire, but that the owners just are ignoring the tenants, and because there isn't that requirement for that opportunity to purchase and to negotiate fairly. So once the community buys their community, they are a little democracy. They elect their board of directors, they create the rent, they create the rules, and they create the membership criteria. So we have almost 9,000 households in New Hampshire in our 145 ROCs, and they really get to secure their rent. The only time rent goes up is if, say, they have infrastructure projects that they vote and approve to invest in and spend money on, then rent might go up, but it is a not-for-profit. And so the rent is focused, rent increases, and what the money of the co-op goes to is to sustain that community and make that community a better place. If at such point in time a community ever wanted to sell, they are officially nonprofits, not-for-profits, and you can't sell for a profit. It has to go to another affordable housing investment. And then all resident-owned communities are required to have reserves by lenders, and they're all required to have a 10-year capital improvements plan, so that there's a plan for maintenance and upkeep. So this photo and the next photo are actually pictures of brand new Energy Star 500 square foot, so small, 1-bedroom, 1-bath homes that we worked with ROC-NH Cooperative in Danville, New Hampshire. All of them are Energy Star homes, and they were specifically brought in, and this is actually a crew from Home Depot who donated the landscaping for veterans. They were all formerly homeless veterans that had been working with Harbor Care, and we placed 10 homes in this community, and with partnerships between Harbor Homes, Next Step US, Merrimack County Savings Bank, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, we were able to install these 10 homes, and now 10 homeless veterans, formerly homeless veterans, are housed. And actually we have a really great video on this project on our website, which I'll put in the chat afterwards. And so just to focus on the Upper Valley, which I know where most of you are from, we have currently 13 communities that are resident-owned communities in the Upper Valley. If you ever want to check one out and drive through, you can see their names here and their towns. In total, there's 485 homes in these 13 communities. So that's a lot of affordable housing in this area, with a total of 11 vacant lots and 6 lots that are homes that have been abandoned or need substantial rehabilitation. And so in total, there's 17 opportunities for new affordable home ownership options that are not subsidized in the community. And just for a quick map perspective, I know you can't read the text, but here's where our 145 resident-owned communities are located across New Hampshire. So you can really see there, it's from top to bottom, east to west, and these are a critical and essential part of our affordable housing in New Hampshire. And then just to get to a specific story, this is Mascoma Meadows in Lebanon, and you can see it's a 50-home community. And you see the solar array right in front. It's a 100-kilowatt solar array, and it's our first resident-owned community to have a solar array installed. And the land for the solar array is actually, if you look to the left, there's the Assembly of God Church, and the church owns that land and was in the process of selling it to this resident-owned community to be able to install the solar. And actually, pretty amazing story. On Easter Sunday morning, just as the sale was going through, the residents of the church voted to donate the land to the resident-owned community for the solar. So it's a great Upper Valley story. And if you are a member of that church, thank you. If you know somebody who's a member of that church, please thank them, because there were many happy tears that day. And that residents of that community felt truly valued by their neighbors and their neighborhood. And that community then voted to make sure that the majority of the benefit to the reduced electricity bill went to the lowest income residents. So they got the biggest reductions in their rent. So this is a quick overview of manufactured housing and our resident-owned community model. It's what we've done for almost 40 years. And really what we want you to think of is that these are homes. And this is a great opportunity of affordable housing in New Hampshire that exists today, that isn't highly subsidized, and we think has the potential to be here and do a heck of a lot more for affordable housing in our communities. There's my contact information. It is huge. And so I will stop sharing my screen now to be able to answer some questions. But for us to do what we do, we need partners, and that's where you guys come in. And we're happy to work with anybody, anytime. And some of you already are our partners, I see on this call, and to help spread the word about the value and benefit of resident-owned communities and our manufactured homes. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Before we jump into questions, I see that there is one in the chat. I just think it'll be an opportunity for you to kind of just clarify some of what a resident-owned community is versus manufactured home community in general. And the question is, can a manufactured home community be structured as a regular old-fashioned condominium rather than a resident-owned community?
That's a good question. So the answer would be yes, but it would come with none of the protections. It wouldn't be not-for-profit. It wouldn't have the protection of the ought to purchase or the opportunity to purchase. It wouldn't come with any of those things. And I think it would, if it's an existing park, if it was an existing park that was up for sale and it didn't go through this process, it would violate the state law on this process. But if you were, say, to build a new community, of which we have one coming on board in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, actually, because they have a resident-owned community there that has been so successful, the town changed their zoning for the first time to allow another community built. And so they have a new community coming on board there. I guess in theory, you could try to condoize it, but again, you wouldn't enjoy any of the protections of the RSA 205.
And I wanted to just do a follow up on that briefly. Sarah, you mentioned that due to zoning restrictions, this community was able to get built because of they changed some of their zoning. And can you just briefly maybe describe, before we open up into general questions and reflections, what some of those zoning restrictions have been and how they have limited the use of manufactured home parks as a affordable housing option?
Absolutely. So actually, you'll find in most communities in New Hampshire that new manufactured home parks are expressly disallowed by zoning, that you're not allowed to create them. If they aren't expressly disallowed, when you look at your zoning ordinance, the density requirements, right, the amount of land, the amount of frontage, and the amount of setbacks that are required for any individual lot, and the number of housing units that can be placed on any individual lot would preclude a park from or a new community from being built. So most of our zoning ordinances are either directly or implicit or indirectly exclusionary for the building of new manufactured home communities. And some towns go so far as to actually expressly prohibit manufactured housing, even on its own individual land. But that is less common today.
Great, thanks. And there's a few more other questions that have popped up in the chat, and I want to just open this up since we only have 10 more minutes left. Just also, if there are any lingering questions for Don and Bridget, or just general thoughts and questions related to the this webinar, then please feel free to bring those up as well.
I can jump into the first one. I can see the chat if you want.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, so the first one is, so the nonprofit owns the land and the homes are owned by the residents. So the resident-owned community and what the lending covers in purchasing that is for the land and infrastructure for the community and underneath. And the individual residents own their homes. They have their own mortgage or own them outright, and they pay a lot rent to the owner of the park. And if the owner of the park is the resident-owned community, then they pay the rent to that person. But they're the resident-owned communities in general don't own any homes. Some of the bigger ones do own a community center. There's quite a few that have, say, a garage space, right? Because they're plowing roads, they're handling those kind of things. So they do need garages or sheds, and they don't own homes for the vast majority of them. And then question number 2, in areas where ROCs are located, where there's no municipal sewer and water, how do they handle wells and septics? They do. They're part of their and stormwater. Actually, I'm sure you guys know in the Upper Valley, stormwater is a big infrastructure important thing to think about too. There are community wells, there are community septics. Sometimes there are different numbers of homes that are served by any one community septic, but all those pieces of infrastructure are included in any community's capital improvement plan and are serviced by the community, just as they were before when they were owned by a private owner. And so all the maintenance and upkeep of those systems is part of the community's responsibility. And the communities are not left on their own. The secret sauce that helps our borrowers pay 97% of the time and helps these communities run really effectively is our technical assistance support that comes with every loan that we provide, and comes with it for the life of the loan. And so we're right there with you, helping to navigate those. These are individual democracies, right? And they're not always perfect and they're not always smooth, but that's what we're here to help with. Let's see, I think there's another one. Okay, no. Any other questions? So yeah, we're hoping we have 3 more resident-owned communities currently under 60-day notices and in the process of purchasing their communities. And so we're hoping we'll be up to 148 by maybe the summer.
I have a last question if nobody else is chomping at the bit. I had read and saw that nationwide there's been an interest of sort of outside equity coming in and purchasing up manufactured home parks that are being sold by, and oftentimes a lot of the existing owners of the parks are sort of aging out and they want to sell the parks, and that it's sort of become an attraction for outside investment. Is this something that you're seeing in the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we had a park just in December that went that route. And so essentially what's happening is large equity firms, which honestly are quite possibly what you and I have our retirement funds sitting in, have discovered that these parks are actually very good investments because they come in and they look at the area median rent. Just to be clear, the rent in our parks on a monthly basis, the lot rent is, let's say, between $350 on the low end to maybe $700 on the high end, but most are in the $400 or $500 a month for lot rent. And again, you're paying for your home and your mortgage separately. So if you look at the lot rent and you're looking at the average rent in the area, say that's $1,500 or $1,800, they are offering the private equity firms are coming in and offering astronomically high amounts on a per lot basis because they're going to buy the park and they're going to raise the rent to 2/3 of area median income rent. So we've seen several large parks go this way in New Hampshire recently. 2 in Rochester, 1 in the Lakes region, and within a year, rents have gone up by more than $100, more than $150 in a year, and then the next year they'll go up by another massive chunk, and it's forcing people who have affordable, stable housing, especially those who are on a fixed income, to have to sell their only asset and then try to rent where, right? I mean, the average cost for people who borrow from our welcome home loan teams who buy a manufactured home with lot rent and their mortgage is about $1,300 a month, and that's a heck of a lot cheaper than the $15 to $18 to $2,000 a month we're seeing in average rent. And you own it. It's an asset that you own and you build. So by private equity coming in and offering these really high values for a lot, and then the residents have to match that price to negotiate with the property owner, it puts them in an unsustainable position of having to come up with the last park in Rochester. Here's a great example. We had two recently, a small one in Campton that 3 years ago sold. The owner sold it and offered it to the residents at $900,000, and the residents said, no, we don't want to do that. A smaller park that was going to be a rent increase, I think of maybe $40 a month for them to afford the payment of that, and the residents voted not to do that. Another investor bought it, and they did very minor improvements to it, and in 2 years they put it back on the market, and the residents were then had to meet a $4 million asking price 2 years later. And so they just did vote to purchase their community, but their lot rent's going up by over $150 to pay those payments, because that's what the investor could do. And in Rochester, we just saw a park go for sale for $46 million, right? And so even though there was 400 units there, 350 units there, that's an incredible lot increase when you're when those lots are being valued at, say, $80,000 per lot, when we're used to seeing them being valued at maybe $45,000 per lot. And so that's a really hard, private equity is outpricing and making it really difficult for resident-owned communities to form.
Thank you, Sarah. Just a quick question is there an equivalent in Vermont, on the Vermont side of things? I know ROC-USA, I think, has some network connections in Vermont, but could you kind of explain what some of those might be?
Yes. So
sorry, we are also like very, very late on time. So just like 2 minute for.
Sure. The short answer is we were really successful in New Hampshire and created ROC-USA. That actually grew out of us. ROC-USA is the nationwide branch of us. They operate in the rest of the country outside of New Hampshire. They are based in Concord, and they will support the creation of resident-owned communities across the country. So yes, there are some in Vermont, and they provide the financing just like we do, and they provide the long-term technical assistance support as well.
Great. So Sarah Danley, do you want to close things out? Thank you, Sarah Marchant, for the presentation, answering any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Don and Bridget and Sarah. This has been really great having all of your perspectives. I wish we could keep talking. I mean, I'll just say for my part, like one of the things that really struck me was how much all of this is about relationships and like good, stable relationships with the landowner, and having that be a party that you can trust and build a relationship with. And then also this theme of the relationships with the funders and with the financiers, and like the importance of the local bank for Don and Bridget, and also the work that the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund is doing in making ROCs a reality. So I want us to be able to end on time, but the rhetorical question I would pose at the end that we could continue discussing if anyone stays on after the end is just, how can we work on building more of those relationships in our own communities to actually make more of this type of arrangement possible? So after posing that rhetorical question, the really logistical closeout is just that you will all be receiving a follow-up email that will have a recording, the slides, and a reminder and registration link for the next webinar in the series, as well as the link to that Jamboard again. So yeah, I'm happy to keep the Zoom room open for a few minutes, but we are at 6:30 and wanted to end on time, so you'll be receiving additional information by follow-up email. And thank you, a huge thank you again to all three of our guest speakers. If anyone has any thoughts or reflections on that, on anything, you're welcome to share. I don't have to close out of the Zoom room right away, but Alan, oh, were you about to say something, Alan, or are you just saying hi?
Hi. Hi. No, I have a thought. I'm pretty familiar with the ROC model, but the information that Sarah shared really filled in some gaps. One of the things that I was shocked by was I did not know that zoning, I didn't connect those dots with respect to zoning and density, how it really effectively thwarts a highly successful model from being expanded, with the exception, I think she may have said Wolfboro. So to me, to answer your question, Sarah, what we might do is, that gives me a talking point to take to others.
Okay, thanks, Alan.
And Sarah, just FYI, your video is frozen again.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I don't know if you can even still hear me. My Zoom is completely freezing now on my end.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Don and Bridget.
Thanks everyone.